The rain had been steady since sunset, washing the city in streaks of silver. Daniel guided his old sedan down the slick streets, wipers dragging across the windshield in a tired rhythm. The heater rattled faintly, fighting the chill. Another ride request blinked on his phone, and he accepted it with a sigh. Nights like this weren't easy, but they kept the lights on at home. He pulled up outside a tall glass tower just as a man in a long coat rushed to the curb. The passenger slid into the back seat, muttering about being late. "Emergency meeting," he said under his breath, already glued to his phone. Daniel didn't ask questions. Years of driving had taught him when silence was better, but the words stuck with him. As the car rolled closer to downtown, Daniel noticed something strange. Whole blocks were darker than they should have been. Streetlights flickered, neon signs glowed faintly, and the tall tower itself shone unevenly, as if the building were holding its breath. Through wide panes of glass, he caught a glimpse of people in suits moving quickly across the lobby, voices raised, hands cutting the air with urgency. At a stoplight, Daniel glanced again at the tower. Just then, the doors opened as another group hurried in, and a snatch of conversation carried out into the wet night. Overload, cooling loop, failing sensors. The words hit him like old ghosts. He tightened his grip on the wheel. He knew that language. Years ago, it had been his world. The car behind him honked, snapping him back. He pressed the gas, the sedan humming forward, but his chest ached with a weight he couldn't quite shake. He thought of Emma, already asleep at home, her small frame curled around her stuffed rabbit, the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling keeping her company. He thought of the promise he had made to her, to always be there, no matter what. And yet, as he glanced once more at the flickering windows of the tower, a restless pull stirred inside him. He had walked away from that life for good reason, but tonight, the storm whispered something he didn't want to admit. His past might not be finished with him. The words he'd overheard lingered in his chest long after he pulled away from the light. Overload, cooling loop, sensors. They weren't just technical terms, they were fragments of another life, one he had walked away from years ago. Back then, Daniel wasn't behind the wheel of an aging sedan. He was an electrical engineer trusted to keep massive systems alive when failure wasn't an option. Long nights in control rooms, the hum of machinery, the adrenaline of solving problems no textbook could explain. That had been his world. But life doesn't pause for careers. When Sarah got sick, everything he thought permanent slipped through his hands. The hospital visits, the treatments, the bills that stacked higher than his paychecks. There was no way to balance it all. So he did the only thing he could. He walked away. For 18 months, his days were spent sitting beside her, holding her hand through the hardest hours, while his nights were filled with caring for Emma, who was still small enough to climb into his lap and ask why Mommy was so tired all the time. And when the fight was finally lost, Daniel was left standing at a graveside with a daughter who didn't understand why the world had changed overnight. He made a promise that day, a vow as solid as anything he'd ever built. Emma would never feel alone. He wouldn't vanish into work the way so many fathers did. No matter what it cost him, she would have his time, his presence, his love. So he traded blueprints for late-night driving shifts, conference calls for morning walks to school. Their apartment was small, their furniture second-hand, and money often tight. But Emma never doubted that her dad would be there, waiting at the gate when school let out, listening as she described her science projects and playground games. Still, some nights were harder than others. Nights like this one, when the storm pressed against the city and the glow of that building reminded him of what he once was. A man who could steady chaos with a calm voice and a steady hand. Daniel shook his head, forcing the thought away. He had chosen this life for a reason. He was a father before he was anything else. And yet, as the windshield wipers scraped across the glass, he couldn't escape the restless truth rising inside him. The man he used to be wasn't gone. He was still there, waiting, whether Daniel wanted him back or not. Traffic slowed as Daniel rolled past the tall tower again, the same one where he had dropped off his passenger earlier. Morning meetings were long gone, But inside the glass walls, the building was still alive with frantic movement. Figures in suits hurried back and forth across the lobby, voices sharp, gestures tense. Even from the street, Daniel could feel the weight of something gone wrong. He stopped at a red light, and for a moment the rain eased enough for him to see more clearly. The lobby doors opened as a group rushed inside, and a snatch of their conversation carried into the night. Words he hadn't heard in years, but words he understood instantly. Overload, cooling loop, sensor failure. Daniel froze, the sound hitting him like a punch to the chest. Those weren't just words, that was a language he used to speak fluently. In an instant, he could picture the readings, the cascading shutdowns, the alarms screaming as systems failed one by one. His pulse quickened with a memory he thought he'd buried, standing in a control room at 2 a.m, making decisions that kept neighbourhoods from going dark. The light turned green and a horn blared behind him. Daniel pressed the gas, pulling away, but his eyes lingered in the mirror. Through the wide panes of glass he caught a glimpse of screens glowing red, engineers pointing, arguing, their faces tight with frustration. He didn't need the sound to know the rhythm of the room. He had lived it. His chest tightened. It wasn't just a company's problem, it was the city's problem. If the grid collapsed, it wouldn't stop at the walls of that tower. It would ripple into homes, hospitals, schools. He pictured Emma's classroom, the hallways where her science fair project would hang on display. He pictured her waking up in the dark, confused, afraid, the way he had seen whole families react when the power cut without warning. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles pale in the glow of the dashboard. He told himself it wasn't his concern anymore. He had made his choice years ago. He was just a driver now, a father keeping one small promise every day, to be there when his daughter needed him. And yet, as the building disappeared in his rearview mirror, the words he'd overheard wouldn't leave him. Overload, cooling loop, sensors. Each syllable echoed with something more than memory. It was recognition. He knew what they were missing. He could see it as clearly as if he was standing in that room again. The rain thickened, blurring the windshield, but Daniel couldn't shake the truth pressing against him. He wasn't done with that world, not yet. Daniel parked a block away, unable to keep driving. The rain had slowed to a mist, but his chest felt heavier with every breath. Through the wet windshield, he could still see the glow of the tower, screens flickering behind glass, silhouettes pacing in agitation. He didn't need the sound to know what was happening inside. He had lived those nights before, when seconds mattered and failure meant whole neighbourhoods waking up in the dark. He shut off the engine but stayed in the seat, hands locked around the steering wheel. "Don't do this," he told himself. "This isn't your life anymore. You've got a daughter who needs you in the morning. That's what matters." But the words he'd overheard kept circling in his mind like stubborn echoes. Overload, cooling loop, sensors. They weren't abstract terms, they were warnings. He could see the problem as clearly as if the screens were in front of him, the same patterns he had once spent years chasing down. He thought of Emma, her bright eyes looking up at him at the school gate. He thought of the way she relaxed when she spotted him in the pickup line, the way she trusted he would always be there. That promise was the reason he had walked away from this world in the first place. He had chosen her, always her. And yet another image pressed in. Emma's school dark and cold, teachers scrambling, children unsettled. A blackout wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was families huddling in the dark, hospitals running thin, people afraid. If this system went down, it wouldn't be contained to that room upstairs. It would spill into the streets, into homes, into lives like his daughter's. Daniel closed his eyes, torn in two. If he stepped in, they might laugh, dismiss him, throw him out. He was just a driver in their eyes, invisible. Worse, if he wasted their time and was wrong, he'd be the fool who interfered. But if he stayed in his car, said nothing, and the city went black, what would he tell Emma then? That he saw it coming and turned away? The thought made his stomach twist. Showing up for her wasn't just about walking her to school or packing her lunchbox. Maybe it also meant not looking the other way when he could make a difference. Rain tapped against the hood, soft but insistent. Daniel exhaled slowly, then opened the door. The cold air rushed in, damp and sharp. He pulled his jacket tighter and started toward the building, each step heavier than the last, as if he were walking back into a world he had promised himself he'd left behind. The lobby was bright and sterile, the kind of place where every step echoed. Daniel hesitated near the security desk, rain still dripping from his jacket, feeling the weight of every curious glance. He didn't belong here, anyone could see that. "I need to speak to someone upstairs," he said quietly, surprising even himself. "I think I know what's happening with your system." The guard raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "This floor is restricted, sir. Employees only." His tone wasn't cruel, just final, the way people dismissed someone they thought had nothing to offer. Daniel almost turned back, but his feet carried him toward the glass doors anyway. Through them, he saw a room buzzing with panic, engineers pointing at screens, shaking their heads, frustration etched across every face. He lifted a hand and knocked. The door opened a moment later. A middle-aged man in a crisp shirt looked him up and down, irritation flashing across his face. "This is a secure meeting," he snapped. "You need to leave." Daniel steadied himself. "I overheard your team mention overload and cooling loops. You're chasing the wrong thing. I think your backup sensors are misreading and shutting everything down." The man's expression hardened. "And you are?" Daniel hesitated. He hated saying it out loud, but there was no other way. "I used to be an electrical engineer. I've seen this before, years ago." The man's eyes flicked over his rain-soaked jacket, his tired face. Whatever Daniel had been once, all he saw now was a driver out of place. "We've got PhDs in here who can handle it. Do yourself a favour, go home." The words stung more than he expected. For a moment, Daniel felt the shame rise hot in his chest. Maybe the man was right, maybe he had no business here. He stepped back, ready to leave. Then another voice broke the silence. "Wait." It came from a young woman inside, standing at a terminal, her badge marked intern. She looked between Daniel and the glowing screens. "What did you say about the sensors?" Daniel paused, one foot already in retreat. He pointed to a number flashing on the nearest monitor, visible through the doorway. "That pressure gap, it's small, but enough to trigger a false alarm. Your system thinks it's overheating when it's not. If you don't reset it the right way, it'll just keep shutting down." The project manager scoffed. "We've run diagnostics a dozen times. We don't need input from..." But the intern was already frowning at the data, her curiosity outweighing her doubt. Something in the way Daniel spoke, not pushy, not arrogant, just steady, made her pause. "It might be worth checking," she said softly. Daniel didn't move, his pulse racing. He wasn't sure if they'd listen, but for the first time all night, he wasn't completely invisible. The young intern pulled the keyboard toward her, eyes flicking nervously between the glowing data and the stranger standing at the door. Around her, the others muttered their doubts, but no one stopped her. Desperation made people more willing to gamble. "All right," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'm isolating the backup sensors, shifting control to the primary loop." Her fingers tapped quickly, every keystroke echoing in the tense room. Daniel watched, his heart pounding. He hadn't stood in a control room like this in years, and yet it felt too familiar, like muscles remembering an old motion. He leaned just slightly forward, careful not to overstep. The screens flickered. For a fleeting moment, several of the red indicators softened to yellow, one or two even flashing green. Hope stirred in the room like a held breath. Then, just as suddenly, the numbers spiked again. Alarms shrieked. The wall of screens bled red. The entire system buckled back into failure. Groans filled the room. The project manager gave a bitter laugh, turning toward Daniel with a smirk. "Congratulations, you've wasted 5 minutes we didn't have." Daniel's stomach sank. This was what he feared. That he would look like a fool, an outsider trying to play expert. He stepped back, the weight of humiliation pressing down hard. Maybe he should just leave. Maybe they were right. But then he noticed the intern still staring at the readings, her brow furrowed. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. It wasn't nothing. For a moment it stabilized. Daniel froze at her words, almost worked. That phrase unlocked a memory so vivid it made his pulse quicken. How many nights had he chased failures that looked final, only to discover the truth buried inside the attempt that nearly succeeded? He cleared his throat, voice steadier this time. "You're close. The problem isn't just the backup fighting the primary, it's the calibration. The system's reading a tiny pressure gap and treating it like a full-scale emergency. You need to reset the circuit manually, lock out the backup until the numbers line up, and only then bring it back online." The project manager shook his head, exasperated. "This is reckless. We don't have time to babysit a stranger's theories." The intern glanced at the lead engineer. "He's not guessing," she said. "Look at the data. It makes sense." The lead engineer hesitated, conflict written on his face. Nothing else had worked. Every option had been tried and failed. And now here was this man, rain-soaked and exhausted, speaking with the calm certainty of someone who'd lived through storms like this before. "Try it," the intern urged. The room went quiet again. Daniel could feel every eye on him, some hostile, some doubtful, and one or two clinging to hope. He wasn't sure if they'd follow through, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over yet. The room was restless after the failed attempt. Engineers argued over numbers, voices overlapping in frustration. Some pushed for shutting the system down entirely, others barked about backup generators and buying more time. No one had a clear path forward. Daniel stood near the doorway, damp jacket clinging to his shoulders, feeling like an intruder who should have left already. The sting of the project manager's words still burned, but his eyes stayed locked on the screens. Tiny decimals shifted across the data, numbers most people would ignore, but to Daniel they told a story. He knew that story. He had lived it. He took a steady breath. "Listen," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your backup isn't lying, it's just panicking. It sees a fraction of pressure difference and treats it like a disaster. You don't need more scans, you need to reset it manually, let the primary loop hold steady, and only bring the backup online once they're in sync." The project manager rolled his eyes. "Or we could keep listening to a driver in a wet jacket. Brilliant." Daniel didn't flinch. "If you keep doing what you're doing, you'll lose the entire system. If I'm wrong, you'll know in minutes. But if I'm right, you'll stop this before it spreads." His tone wasn't arrogant, it was calm. The voice of someone who'd carried responsibility when mistakes weren't an option. The lead engineer hesitated. He glanced at the intern, who nodded firmly. "It makes sense," she said. "We've tried everything else. This is worth the risk." For a moment, the room stood still. Then the lead engineer gave a short nod. "Do it." The intern's fingers moved quickly, entering the commands. The hum of machines deepened as the system shifted. Seconds crawled. One red light flickered amber, then green. Another followed, then another. The alarms quieted, the data steadied, the wall of crimson softened until the entire screen glowed steady green. Silence fell. Engineers stared at the monitors as if afraid to breathe. Then someone whispered, "It's back. It's really back." Daniel let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed through him, but not pride. Just the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen chaos calm down before. For a brief moment, he felt like the man he used to be, the one who steadied storms. Then his phone buzzed. A reminder lit the screen. Morning pickup at Emma's school. He slipped it back into his pocket, his decision clear. "I should go," he said simply. Heads turned toward him, a mixture of awe and curiosity. But Daniel didn't linger. Without waiting for thanks, he stepped back into the hallway, the rain waiting for him outside. Because no matter what had happened here tonight, there was one truth he couldn't forget. Emma would be looking for him at the school gate, and that was the promise he had no intention of breaking. By the time Daniel reached the school the next morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sky was breaking into pale grey. His jacket was still damp from the long night, his eyes gritty with exhaustion, but he kept walking toward the gate, blending into the quiet crowd of parents waiting for their kids. The building buzzed with end-of-day chatter as the classroom doors opened. Children spilled out in clusters, laughing, waving papers, dragging backpacks almost too big for their shoulders. And then Daniel saw her. Emma spotted him instantly. Her face lit up, and she broke into a run, ponytail bouncing behind her. Daniel crouched as she threw herself into his arms. He lifted her for a brief second before setting her down again. breathing in the warm, familiar scent of rain and crayons. "You came," she said, grinning as if she'd ever doubted. "Of course," Daniel murmured, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "I'll always come." Emma slipped her hand into his as they walked toward the car. She chatted about lunch trades in the cafeteria, about how Mrs. Johnson had read a story in class, and about the drawing of a rocket she wanted to show him when they got home. Daniel listened, nodding, letting her voice fill every tired corner of him. He didn't mention the night before. He didn't tell her about the alarms, the engineers, the way a city had quietly been saved. To Emma, he wasn't an expert or a stranger who had walked into a room full of blinking lights. He was just Dad, the man who showed up, who stood waiting at the gate, who kept his promises. At a crosswalk, Emma leaned against his arm, her voice suddenly softer. "Daddy, I like when you're here. When I look up and see you waiting, it makes everything feel better." Daniel's throat tightened. Out of every title he'd ever had, this was the one that mattered most. He squeezed her small hand in his. "That's never going to change," he said quietly. The light turned and they crossed together, the world around them humming back to life, steady and ordinary, just the way Daniel wanted it to be. Friday afternoon brought the kind of sunshine that made the playground smell faintly of cut grass and chalk. Parents clustered along the sidewalk, chatting idly as they waited for the final bell. Daniel stood a little apart, coffee cup in hand, content in the quiet rhythm of dismissal. He liked this part of the day. The ordinary moments where he blended in, just another dad waiting for his kid. That was when he noticed her. A woman in a dark coat, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached with calm purpose. Even before she spoke, he knew. He had seen her the night of the blackout, standing at the head of the table, steady in the chaos. Ms. Reynolds. "Mr. Turner," she said gently, stopping in front of him. Daniel straightened, uneasy under the curious glances of nearby parents. "Yes." She offered a hand, her expression softened now. "I'm Margaret Reynolds, Director of Operations at the Energy Company. We haven't forgotten what happened the other night. I wanted to thank you personally." Before Daniel could reply, the school doors burst open and Emma came running out, waving a paper in her hand. She spotted her father, then slowed when she noticed the stranger beside him. "Daddy?" she asked, tilting her head. Daniel smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Emma, this is Ms. Reynolds. She works at the building I told you about." Ms. Reynolds crouched slightly, so she was at Emma's level. "Your dad helped us fix something very important. We couldn't have done it without him." Emma's eyes widened. She held up the paper she'd been clutching, a drawing of a rocket surrounded by stars. "My teacher says I should keep asking questions until I figure things out. Daddy always tells me the same thing." She pressed the drawing into her father's hand with a grin. "See? We both like fixing things." Daniel's chest tightened. Out of the mouths of children, truth always landed sharper. Miss Reynolds stood again, her tone more formal. "We'd like to offer you a position, senior engineer, full benefits, flexible hours. We want you back where you belong." The words felt heavy in Daniel's ears. Around them, other parents collected their children, glancing over at the unexpected scene. Daniel stayed quiet, his hand resting on Emma's small shoulder. "That's generous," he said finally, "but I have to think about what it means for her." Ms. Reynolds nodded. "Of course, I understand. Just know the door is open." Emma tugged at his sleeve as they walked toward the car, her backpack bouncing. "Daddy, if you work with them, does that mean I can see the big machines? And maybe we can build something together for my science fair?" Daniel smiled faintly, tucking her hair behind her ear. "Maybe. We'll see. What matters most is that I'm here with you." Emma nodded firmly, satisfied, and skipped ahead. Daniel lingered a step behind, watching her, feeling the weight of the choice settle into his bones. The offer letter sat on the kitchen table beside a stack of bills and Emma's crayon drawings. Daniel stared at it while the sound of cartoons drifted from the living room. Salary, benefits, flexible hours. The words were tempting, but his eyes kept sliding to Emma's sketch of a rocket ship taped crookedly to the fridge. He thought of Sarah, of hospital corridors and whispered promises at her bedside. He thought of the vow he'd carried ever since, to never let Emma feel abandoned. That promise had guided every sacrifice, every late-night drive, every bleary-eyed morning waiting at the school gate. And yet, as he held the letter in his hands. Another truth pressed in. Maybe showing up for Emma also meant showing her what it looked like to use your gifts fully. The next morning, as they walked to school together, Emma asked, "Daddy, are you going to take the job?" Her voice was light, but her eyes searched him with an honesty he couldn't ignore. Daniel squeezed her hand. "I think I will, but only if they promise I can still walk you to school." Emma smiled, swinging his hand. "Then they'd better say yes." Later that week, Daniel returned to the glass tower, no longer as a driver waiting outside, but as someone invited in. The badge they handed him didn't say Senior Engineer. It read Consulting Specialist. He liked that. It sounded less like a title, more like a role. Someone who helped when he was needed, but still kept his own life. At his first team meeting, he didn't talk about the blackout or what he had done. He simply said, "Good ideas can come from anywhere. Let's not forget that." A few engineers looked uneasy, but others nodded, remembering the night a soaked stranger had walked in and saved the system. That evening, Daniel and Emma sat at the kitchen table working on her science fair project. A cardboard generator model, wires taped carefully, a tiny bulb waiting to glow. When it finally flickered to life, Emma clapped her hands. "It works!" Daniel chuckled, brushing a smudge of glue from her cheek. "You did it!" Emma shook her head firmly. "No, Daddy, we did it." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, warmth filling the quiet kitchen. He realised the real victory wasn't the job, or the paycheck, or even the respect he had earned back. It was this: his daughter's trust, her pride, the light in her eyes when she looked at him. Success, he knew now, wasn't about titles or applause. It was about the promises you kept, and the light you managed to leave in the people who counted on you. True success isn't measured by titles or applause. It's measured by the promises you keep, and the light you bring to the people who count on you. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. I'm truly grateful for your time and support. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you again soon, right here on Rain Inside.